Hello, second graders. Welcome to Read Aloud with me, Miss Taylor. We are going to read chapter 9 from the 1001 Arabian Nights. All right, and chapter 9 is called The Everlasting Shoes. So, Scheherazade has lived another night, it seems. One night, Scheherazade arrived in the king's bedchamber only to find him already asleep. Thinking she had come late and missed her opportunity to tell a story, she crept under the covers and lay in the hollow of the king's arm, searching the beehive cells of her heart for honey words to sweeten his temper in the morning. She's like, oh, I better think of a good story to tell. Knowing that her art lay more in storytelling than in pleading or flattery, she opened her lips and whispered, Merciful Allah sees and knows me, small as I am. Perhaps Allah, who writes the story of every man's life from its first letter to its last, full stop, will grant me opportunity to tell Shahryar one more story and delight his heart with one more tale. So saying, she closed her eyes and slept, as beautiful as a frost-covered reed floating on the river. The next morning, King Shahryar, floating in the slack water between the ebb tide of sleep and the flow tide of waking, grumbled, Oh, another day of listening to greedy merchants slandering each other. They expect me to make judgments on who owns a camel and who overcharged for a cow. The world is full of greed, Scheherazade, as a duck egg is full of duck. I go to the audience chamber each day, and my heart drops lower and lower like a bucket in a well. Down, down, down. Greed, greed, greed. Oh, people are so greedy and selfish. King Shahryar is feeling kind of sad and frustrated, it sounds. Would it raise your heart a little then, my melancholy and overburdened lord, to hear a story of a dreadful old miser who lived in Cairo once and suffered fittingly for his meanness? The king was instantly awake. But it's morning. I missed my story. Oh, remember he fell asleep at the end of um, the last one. He just fell asleep the last night. He didn't get his story. But it's morning. I missed my story, he said in astonishment. I lay down yesterday evening because my head ached, and I slept right through your story. I said, oh, I had a headache last night. I just laid down and I missed my nightly story. Hey, it's kind of like my kids when we haven't read a story before bed. They're like, hey, wait, I'm going to do story time. Ah, well, shall I tell it to you tonight, O bright and inexhaustible king? Said Scheherazade. Oh, first I shall hear the story of the miser. Tell the other tomorrow. It's like, well, I'll hear a story now, and then I'll hear a new one tomorrow. So, giving thanks to Allah, Scheherazade helped the king to dress and brushed his hair, which in her eyes seemed as dark and soft as the black swan's winter down on the palace lake. There was once a chemist in Cairo, said Scheherazade that night, who was almost as famous for his wealth as he was for his meanness. They said of Abu Qasim that he was born with arms too short, they never did reach his pockets. What is money but for spending and giving to those who have none? But Abu Qasim buried his money as though it would grow and hid it in drawers as though it would perfume his clothes. So he buried his money or put it in drawers instead of giving it to help others. But thanks to his miserliness, his clothes were not perfumed at all. Far from it. He patched the same trousers and bathed in his shirt rather than send it to the laundry. And his shoes were quite the sure sign of his penny pinching. For 20 years he wore the same shoes. Holes in them were patched so often and so cheaply with strips of leather tacked on with round-headed nails that his feet looked like two armadillos. The soles were as thick as the skull of a rhinoceros, and Abu Qasim's shoes became a byword in the houses and halls of Cairo. Oh dear, so he never washes his clothes and never changes his shoes. People would say, this soup is as thick as Abu Qasim's left shoe, and my mother-in-law's cakes are as heavy as Abu Qasim's clogs, or this egg smells as bad as Abu Qasim's right boot. It's like, ooh, his boots are just terribly stinky. In short, all Cairo was well acquainted with Abu Qasim's shoes and the reason for their extraordinary size and weight. On one particularly lovely day, when the sun reminded Qasim of a big golden coin, and every jingling camel's harness put him in mind of money bags, he decided to take his yearly Turkish bath. So sometimes this happened in the Middle East where people would go to a bathhouse to have a bath, and they wouldn't do it very often. It seems like here they would do it each year, have like a really thorough cleaning, and someone would kind of help them. Leaving his shoes on the step and his robe with the cashier, he allowed the Haman masseurs to sweat him and scrape him and soak him and wash him and dry him and perfume him. Lesser men would have shrunk from the task, but the masseurs at the Turkish bath prided themselves on achieving the impossible. Abu Qasim came up almost spotless. Kind of reminds me of if you've seen those like car washes that people go through and they've got him all cleaned up. But he had to leave his shoes out on the steps. Wonder what's going to happen to his shoes. In the meantime, a wealthy merchant, before even his caravan was unloaded, refreshed himself after a long and weary journey with a visit to a Turkish bath. He left his slippers on the step and said to the cashier at the door, "You will frighten away your customers if you leave those horrible slippers of Abu Qasim's on the porch. I shan't share a bath with that man. Put me in another." The Haman attendant agreed, ran outside, and picking up Qasim's stinking shoes with a long pole, he deposited them out of sight in a corner of the porch. It's like, oh, let's get rid of these stinky shoes, put them up there. Consequently, Abu Qasim, on finishing his Turkish bath, came outside to find no shoes on the step except the merchant's handsome silk slippers. So the wealthy man took off his slippers, soled with calfskin, kind of nice and leather. "A miracle!" he exclaimed. "Allah knew that I have always intended to buy shoes like these when I could afford it, and he has worked a transformation. What a saving of money!" He's like, "Oh, God has helped to turn my old stinky shoes into these lovely new ones. Praise Allah." It's like, "Oh, thank you." They fitted exactly, and he pattered off from home and surprised his cook, who could usually hear him clattering all the way up the street. When the merchant could not find his own slippers, so the wealthy man who was in the Turkish bath came out. He's like, "Where are my shoes? Where are my slippers?" His nose told him that Abu Qasim's shoes were still in the porch, and he rooted them out. "Now I know how that rascal Qasim made his fortune," he shouted, "stealing other people's property." And he called all his camel drivers and servants from his caravan, and they marched off in a band to Abu Qasim's chemist shop. There they broke down the door, seized the dumbfounded miser by the scruff of the scruffy neck, and beat him on the floor. Oh dear. The police were called, and Abu Qasim had to pay a large bribe to keep the matter out of the courts. "And you can have back your detestable shoes," said the merchant in parting, and threw them at Abu Qasim's head. "Ugh, here are your stinky shoes." "This is entirely your doing," Qasim whimpered accusingly at the fuming old shoes. The shoes did not defend themselves. He's looking at his shoes. "These are your fault. This whole thing, it's your fault, shoes." Do you ever blame your shoes for things? So he picked them up and threw them, one, two, with all his strength over the garden wall. They hit an old lady who was passing and crushed her like a biscuit. Oh dear. Her relatives wailed and ranted and called out, "Murder! Murder!" until the police arrived. Examining the scene of the crime, they found Abu Qasim's famous footwear, and when Qasim went to his window to discover the reason for the commotion outside, he was hauled over the sill and dragged off to prison in chains. The relatives of the old lady demanded the death of Qasim. Oh dear. But a law, particular to Cairo, fixed the value of a life at 20,000 dinars. That's money. And Abu Qasim was able to escape hanging by paying this to the relatives. So he escaped death by giving some money to her relatives of the lady that he killed by throwing his shoe at her. That must have been a really heavy shoe. Parting with 20,000 dinars was as painful to Abu Qasim as 20,000 wasp stings. Oh, he was so greedy. It was so hard for him to give this money. He howled with misery and kicked his ancient slippers round the house until his feet bled. Then he took them to the Nile River, and dropped them in, hoping never to lay eyes on them again. They floated down the river, reeking and fuming, and the fish rolled over and died. Finally, the shoes caught in the nets of a fisherman, an ox of a man who single-handed could haul in a net full of tuna fish. The nails in Abu Qasim's shoes snagged and tore the twine, and the weight of them stretched the mesh all out of shape, so that the net was entirely ruined by the time the fishermen dragged the slippers ashore. 10,000 curses on that miserable dog, Abu Qasim! I would know these legendary monstrosities anywhere. When the fisherman squeezed his huge body through the door of the chemist's shop, Abu Qasim recognized his shoes dripping in the great paw-like hands. There is no escaping the fate Allah sends. The fisherman tenderized Qasim as he tenderized squid and octopus on the rocks beside the Nile. Oh dear, that means he beat him up. All right, let's see. Just going to pause here. As a parting gesture, he threw the awful footwear against the rows of shelves, smashing all the chemist's stock of precious minerals and herbs. "Oh, Allah, take vengeance on you, contemptible objects!" Qasim sobbed, crawling out into his garden with the shoes and a trowel. Although it was late evening and already dark, he dug a large hole and buried the disreputable shoes out of harm's way. But his neighbors, watching from the bedroom window, saw Abu Qasim digging in his garden in the dark, and knowing his reputation as a miser, thought he must be burying treasure. Ooh, they thought he was maybe burying some money or some gold, when in fact he was just burying his shoes. "That old miser Abu Qasim has run out of floorboards to hide his money under. He digs holes in the garden now and buries it there." Abu Qasim woke to find all manner of people digging furiously in his garden, flinging his herb garden in spadefuls over the wall. Small boys were shaking earth through metal sieves, and metal diviners with bent twigs in their hands were walking up and down his melon beds. No one believed him when he shouted from the window that he had only been burying his shoes, and he had to dig them up again to prove his story, and then pay everyone in the garden, some 154 spade owners, a piece of gold to go away. "I have to be rid of these appalling objects which are a blight on my happiness and a danger on my life," he grizzled, and he walked many miles into the countryside before finding a canal and throwing the shoes into the weir pool. Unfortunately, on the other side of the sluices was a mill whose wheel was driven by the weir. The antique shoes, which, as it has been told, had soles mended to the thickness of a rhinoceros skull, caught in the mill wheel paddles and, shearing all the gears, brought the mill to a violent halt. So it got stuck in a mill, a water wheel. Let's see. Investigating, the miller instantly recognized the infamous slippers of Abu Qasim. "You have seen the size of a miller's shoulders, have you not? His strength comes from lifting sacks of wheat and grain all day long." When the miller found Abu Qasim, he picked him up like a sack of grain and flung him into the mill pond. Abu stayed there until the police arrived. Even after paying for the damage to the mill, Abu Qasim was obliged to pay out the last of his money as a bribe to the police before he was set free. His shoes were, of course, returned to him at the prison gate. "Ill-omened, everlasting slippers, cause of all my misfortunes! Will you kick me all the way to my grave?" Blubbering and babbling, he ran all the way to the high court and presented himself at the Cadi's bench, waving the shoes above his head in a state of hysteria. "In front of witnesses," Abu Qasim cried, "let it be known in all the regions of the Nile, I accuse my boots of malice and conspiracy. I hereby disown them. These shoes are no longer own. I no longer own them. I disown them. From this day forwards, I will have nothing to do with shoes of any kind whatsoever. Abu Qasim no longer owns any slippers. Abu Qasim no longer owns any money. But what of that? I beg your worships not to hold Abu Qasim responsible for anything shoes may do in the future." And he dropped the shoes in the middle of the court and ran out on his bare feet, cursing the whole tribe and family of shoes. Like, oh, shoes. I don't want anything to do with shoes ever again. While behind him in the courtyard, the Cadi laughed so much that he fell off his judgment bench. So the judge thought it was hilarious and he fell on the floor laughing. Who's this crazy guy who's like disowning his shoes and all shoes of the tribe of shoes? While Scheherazade was telling the tale of the everlasting shoes, her husband, King Shahryar, turned his back on her. His face was buried in the pillow and his shoulders jerked up and down. I don't know what he's doing. Anyone who had not lived in the royal palace, as gloomy a place as the bottom of a poisoned well, anyone who had not lived in Sasan's royal city for those 3 sad years might have thought that the king was laughing. The king is laughing at this story about Abu Qasim and his shoes. But Scheherazade wisely said, I am presumptuous, my stern and sober husband, to weave stories out of such light and worthless stuff. Let me redeem a little honor in your beloved's eyes, and tell you a story that is full of heroism, wisdom, and merit. It is the story of the keys of destiny. Oh, tomorrow, Scheherazade, tomorrow, said the king, emerging from his pillow. I'm quite tired with laughing. With listening, I mean. I think I shall sleep now. And just as the tropical sun sets in the blink of an eye, so King Shahryar, the sunshine of all Sasan, fell asleep during the speaking of his own full stop. So he was giggling and then, I must go to sleep. All right, so Scheherazade has lived another night by telling the story of the everlasting shoes. That was a funny story. And she's going to live another night because the king wants to hear the next story about the keys of destiny. Ooh, and that's chapter 10. All right, have a wonderful day, scholars. I'll see you again soon. Bye.